Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Can you see the screen? Can you see my iPad screen?
No.
Oh, it says it's on the stuff. The host says remove the. Okay, let's just begin. I was going to use a present. I was gonna. Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. So, I welcome everyone to this installation of the objectives of fasting. And I hope that Allah eases our hearts and allows us to take benefit from Ramadan, especially in this time period that we are learning lessons of patience in a lot of different ways. The book that was selected is a book which allows us to understand fasting beyond rules. One of the things that I want to present here is that there's some essential points that we want to cover today. One is the second is, how do we know we have to fast? How do we know we have to fast? And the third is, why do we fast? Why do we fast? And the fourth is, what are the benefits of fasting? What are the benefits of fasting? And so that's what we're going to cover in the few minutes. But I wanted to introduce this session by saying that there's some key ideas that are necessary for us to learn as Muslims. One is something that is somewhat of a reminder, because most of us know this already, and that's that all of our actions are judged by intention. All of our actions are judged by their intentions. And so that means that all actions are purposeful. All actions have an aim, an objective. All actions have reasons. And so we have to be clear on what is the reason why we're doing a particular thing. And so it's not only that why is it that we're doing a particular thing, we also have to know what are the goals behind the actions that we are undertaking, or the actions that we're performing. So I may have my reason for why I'm using a pair of scissors, but scissors have a purpose. As an example, scissors are used for a specific thing, specific goal. And so that's with actions in Islam. Each action in Islam has a particular goal. But me, as a person that is going to perform an action that is considered Islamic, I also have to have an intention. I also have to know why I am doing that action. I have to know what that action is for, and what is the goal that that action is to attain or to reach or to aim at, and then why am I doing the action? So if I perform salah, I know that salah is an obligation. In salah, we learn from the Quran and the Sunnah that the reason why it is an obligation is because it is legislated, or it's made an obligation by Allah to remind us of who Allah is. And then there's other things that come along with that, right? But part of it is being reminded of who Allah is and renewing our relationship with Allah. It's a time where we make contact with Allah, where we are connected with Allah, where we communicate with Allah. But then the issue comes in, why am I performing salah? I know what the salah is for now at this point, but why am I performing the salah? Am I performing the salah just because I'm being forced to do it? Or am I performing the salah because I know that it's an obligation, but I have the intention of communicating with Allah. I have the intention of seeking what we call the pleasure of Allah. Having Allah be pleased with us. This is one of the highest states that we can reach as we perform acts in Islam. We should be aiming to reach the pleasure of Allah. And the highest of all is to reach the point where Allah loves us and we love Allah. And so actions are judged by their intentions, right? And so each act of worship, any act of worship that we perform, it needs an intention. And all acts of worship have goals that are to be aimed at or to be realized, goals that should be fulfilled. And so there's some general goals. And so there's some general goals of worship. One is the seeking the pleasure of Allah, right? And the other is to fulfill the obligation of the action. Seeking the pleasure of Allah, remember this, seeking the pleasure of Allah, that's a goal. And then fulfilling the obligation. One of the things that we have to remember is that Islam teaches us how to worship Allah. Islam teaches us how to gain the pleasure of Allah. That's something that's extremely important to understand. So there was a disruption in the connection. And so I want to repeat that again, that Islam teaches us that our main objective overall, the general goal overall, is to seek the pleasure of Allah. The second is that we should know that there's a way to seek the pleasure of Allah. We don't have to make up the way to gain the pleasure of Allah, right? We don't have to make it up. And so that's something that is taught to us by Islam. So Islam teaches us how to gain the pleasure of Allah. And gaining the pleasure of Allah is where we find friendship with Allah, where we're able to learn who Allah is and gain protection from Allah, where we're able to communicate with Allah and have Allah secure us in our lives, in our livelihood, in our sense of everyday life. Sometimes we go through issues. We go through issues where we feel lonely. We go through issues where we feel fear. We go through issues where we feel insecure. We go through issues where we're questioning what's going to happen. So part of having a relationship with Allah is knowing how to communicate with Allah. And part of communicating with Allah and growing with Allah is being obedient to Allah. Being obedient to Allah. Obedience to Allah has a particular purpose. And that purpose is that we gain benefit. All of Islam is for our benefit. It's like a GPS that tells us where good things are at and where bad things are at. And so part of gaining the pleasure of Allah is having that relationship with Allah, so that when we need to call on Allah, we have a direct connection. It's like being at the right spot with your cell phone and you get the connection that goes through. You're being at the right spot with your cell phone and you get the connection so that it goes through. If you're in the right spot with your cell, you won't be able to what? You won't be able to get connectivity. You won't be able to get internet. And so every action has its particular goal or objective. Every action has its particular intention. And so at the end of the day, we should know what we're aiming at. All of that is to say that in the case of fasting Ramadan allows us to know what it is that we have to be able to achieve. Ramadan sets out specific goals for us. And so, for instance, when we talk about why it is that we fast, we're told in the Quran, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. This ayat we hear it over and over again. But in this ayat of the Quran, Allah is telling us that fasting has been legislated upon us, as it was legislated upon the people that came before us. There were other communities that followed prophets before us as Muslims. And so fasting too was legislated upon them. And it was legislated upon us. And we in that process are commanded to fast. The process of following the prophets, we're commanded to fast, just like they were commanded to fast. The thing is this, that in this ayah of the Quran, there's a story behind it. The story that's behind it is that the people that came before us, they were commanded to fast and they were not able to complete with the fast. Imam al-Qurtubi in his tafsir, he talks about how it was that they changed the fast and they tried to meet the goal of fasting, but they changed the fast. They changed the timing of the fast. They changed the amount of time of the fast. And so remember that we said that acts of ibadah or acts of worship, it's about the right, but also following the rules for that action, because it's Allah that sets the rules for that action. It's an instruction for how to perform the action that we find in the command to fast. And so there are particular objectives that we achieve, that we realize there's a set of benefits that we gain when we follow the fast as it was legislated. And in this way, we have in common an understanding of how it is that we gain the pleasure of Allah by fasting. To understand, remember that we said we have a particular intention as to why we do things, and also each act of ibadah or worship has a goal. Here in the Quran, Allah tells us that the fasting was legislated upon us so that we can learn how to be obedient to Allah, so that we can learn how to take benefit, because in being obedient to Allah, the issue comes back down to our benefit. Allah doesn't need our acts of worship. As a matter of fact, the angels have a more perfect worship than we do. As human beings, we make mistakes. But when we discipline ourselves and we attempt and we make effort and we strive and we sacrifice to implement the deen, then our acts of worship take on a different quality than the angels, because we are in the process of using our decision making. We're in the process of surrendering ourselves to worship. So it's an act of worship that's free. The act of worship of the angels is not free. And so that's something that we have to look at and that we have to. So here, one of the things is that when the Quran is saying, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, Imam Izzuddin Abdul Salam, he tells us that here the Quran is telling us that by fasting is perhaps that we may protect ourselves from the hellfire. Protect ourselves from the hellfire. The fast is a reason for forgiving us, for gaining forgiveness or finding forgiveness from Allah for those sins, which the consequence of those sins is the hellfire. And so by fasting, we gain forgiveness if fast is done in the right way. So you can't, for instance, if you cause injury or harm to someone, you can't demand the terms. You can't demand the terms on how it is that you're going to make it up to that person, right? If you took something from someone, you can't just make up how you're going to resolve that situation. There's some rules as to how that situation is going to be resolved. If you committed a crime, there are a certain set of punishments that may follow. So you have to you have to see, how it is that you're going to make amends or how to correct the situation. So for instance, fasting is something that's legislated or something that's obligated upon us because it allows us to correct our relationship with Allah. It allows us to gain forgiveness from Allah in situations which we should be punished, and we should be punished, and part of the punishment is to go into the hellfire. Fasting allows us to repair our relationship with Allah. So that's the first, that the Quran obligates fasting, and that fasting was an obligation that was even followed by other people, other communities that came before us as Muslims. But the problem is they couldn't keep the fast and they changed it. And therefore, that's why in Islam we say that here the act of fasting, it should be done as it was legislated, and it should be done in a way that's pleasing to Allah. And in order for an act to be pleasing to Allah, it should be in accordance with what Allah commands, and it should have the right intention. Our intention should be to come close to Allah. Our intention to be to seek the face of Allah, to seek the pleasure of Allah. Of the benefits of fasting, is to know that fasting raises our station. It means that it elevates us. Fasting increases our iman. Which can be a reward. Fasting is said to be in the Quran and the Sunnah, especially. We find that fasting is an act of worship which is distinct from any other act of worship, and many times it's distinct because it's secret between us and Allah. Only Allah knows if we're really, and we can fake it, but only Allah knows. We can fake it before other people, but only Allah knows if we're really fasting. The other thing is that Allah tells us that Allah will reward us for the fast. Allah will reward us for the fast. Allah has not set a specific determined amount of reward for the fast. As a matter of fact, the only thing that we see is that for the person who fasts and that fast is accepted, that Jannah, that the hereafter, that heaven is the reward for the fast. And we know that in heaven, from what we are teaching of Islam, is that the reward is unlimited. And so fasting is an act of worship that's unique in that part. The other thing is that fasting, from the virtues of it or the benefits of it, is that fasting, what it does is it removes our mistakes, our sins. The other thing is that it disciplines us. It breaks our desire. And fasting is a time period, the time period of fasting now. In the time period of fasting, this is a related but a separate discussion. And the time period of fasting is an opportune time, is a good time for us to get reward, because it's a time period in which sadaqah, the reward for giving and being charitable to people, is multiplied. Another thing is that it's a time period in which a lot of us, we strive, we make an effort to do good deeds. And so it creates an environment in which people are being obedient. And then it's a time period in which we give thanksgiving to Allah, the one who knows what is in our hearts. It's a time period where we become thankful. And one of the benefits of fasting has to do now with the spiritual side, is that fasting, what it allows us to do is to defend ourselves against bad thoughts, which will lead us to sins. And those thoughts will lead us to go against the command of Allah. And so because these things are taken, or our position or our relationship with Allah is elevated. We hear the statement constantly, if Ramadan comes, that the gates of Jannah are open and the gates of the hellfire are closed. And that the shayateen, the plural of shaitan, that they're enchained. We hear that quite often. And so the question before us is, what does that mean? What does that mean? And so Imam Izzuddin Abdul said, one of the things that he said is that how we should understand the up of the gates of Jannah has to do with the fact that we ourselves now are in tune with worshiping Allah. And the closing of the gates of the hellfire is that we ourselves are leaving disobedience to Allah and sin, and we're focusing on our relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Another thing is that because we are fasting, we're leaving our desire and our senses. All of this can become tools for shaitan to influence us, and what we see, what we hear, and and eating and moving. We can go to a place in which we shouldn't be, it's haram, or we can eat something that's haram, or we can see something that's haram, or we can hear something that's haram. But in the month of Ramadan, what becomes haram is haram. It's an opportunity in which we find ourselves in to remove ourselves from the haram. And so we find that this is one of the wisdoms behind this, that the gates of Jannah are opened and the gates of the hellfire are closed, that the shayateen are enchained. And that is a question that people have quite often. They say, well, if the shayateen, if they're enchained, why is it that they're still wrong in the world? That's because people are still in that process of not going into that school. They're not going into that mode. right, of seeking the pleasure of Allah. They're not going into that mode of abandoning their desires. They're not going into that mode of using that. Ramadan is a set time, not by us, but by Allah. It's a time which is set by the lunar calendar, 29 to 30 days, in which, in that time period, we as a community, we focus on developing ourselves spiritually by leaving our desires, by leaving sin, by controlling our thinking, by controlling our interpersonal behavior. Ramadan is a time period in which we leave bad language. For those of us who may use bad language, may Allah protect us. It's a time period in which we leave debate and contention and going back and forth with each other and arguing. It's a time period in which we remind ourselves that we're fasting, and that what fast is not to engage in those types of things. Those types of things like arguing with each other for no purpose, where it becomes combative and it destroys a relationship. Talking to each other in ways which are not appropriate. It's a time period in which we discipline ourselves in how we eat, and how we sleep, and how we think, and what we do. And so it elevates our station in that regard. Of the benefits of fasting, we find that, in that state of fasting, the fast alone is something which is pleasing to Allah. Even the odor of the fast is pleasing to Allah. That doesn't mean that we should walk around with bad odor in our mouths. We shouldn't inconvenience others. But what it does mean is that the state of fasting itself is something which is pleasurable to Allah, more than the smell of musk, which is a beautiful perfume, And there's a time period in which we find ourselves happy for two things. One, is the issue of breakfast, and then the issue of what will be the reward of the fast, which is to encounter Allah in the hereafter, right? And so fasting has those two benefits. One of the things that we're told in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that the acts of the children of Adam, us with the children of Adam, that they're given a reward of 10, right? And sometimes you find that even they can be given a reward of 700 or more, right? And so, for instance, we learn that fasting is not like that. And this is a repetition of the point that was mentioned. Fasting is rewarded by Allah. But the point here is that the teaching says that because the person leaves their desires, they leave their food for the sake of Allah, right? That he's the one that will reward the fast because he leaves his desire. He's talking about the servant. He leaves his food for my sake. And one of the things also that we want to regard before closing down is that the fast is called Junnah. It's called Junnah because it's a protection from the punishment of Allah wa ta'ala. It's a protection from the punishment of Allah wa ta'ala. And so we see that the fast, it allows us to control our thinking. It allows us to be sensitive to those bad ideas that may come. It allows us to control our attitude. It allows us to discipline ourselves so that we don't strengthen our desires. And it puts us in a frame of mind and soul in which we are more sensitive to acts of ibadah, and it also reminds us that our deeds have consequences. So it puts us in direct contact with heaven and hell. And it puts us in a mode where we have to ask ourselves, what is our life aiming at? Is it aiming at heaven or is it aiming at hell? And if we find ourselves making mistakes in the weakness of Iman, we find that we have an opportunity to gain the forgiveness of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, because it's Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala that forgives our sins. And we end on that note. We ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to allow us to live this Ramadan, which is going to be a challenge, but which is going to be an opportunity for us to engage in acts of ibadah, have some tools to be able to deal with this situation that the whole world is going in. It is going to help us to gain patience, and is going to help us to gain strength, is going to help us to become more closer to Allah. ونصلي ونسلم على النبي الكريم والحمد لله رب العالمين. I don't know if there was any questions. I didn't see any questions come through. In the chat. If anyone has any questions, you can send the question through. Okay, so we end on that note. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.